So welcome to SCCEI's public lecture. Thank you all for coming, especially given this week's extreme heat that we have been experiencing. Thankfully, today is a bit better, but still very hot. We are very excited to have all of you here. So my name is Hongbin Li. I'm the faculty co-director of Stanford Center on China's Economy and Institutions, which we call SCCEI, SCCEI. SCCEI is dedicated to generating impactful, evidence-based research that deepens our understanding of China's economy, society, and governance. Our purpose is to provide data-driven insights into challenges and opportunities shaping China's development and its global impact. In addition to advancing research, SCCEI has another important mission: making data-driven research about China more accessible and useful outside of academia. That's one of the motivations behind today's lecture, which aims to bridge the gap between leading empirical work and influential thought in policy, business, and beyond. To that end, I'm very excited to introduce my colleague, Professor Jennifer Pan. Jennifer Pan is the Sir Robert Hall Tung Professor of Chinese Studies, Professor of Communication, Senior Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies, and Professor by courtesy of Political Science and Sociology, all at Stanford. She's a political scientist specializing in the study of political behavior, public opinion, and authoritarian regimes. Her work is particularly focused on understanding how people in non-democratic countries, such as China, interact with and respond to their governments, especially through digital platforms and social media. Through her research, she specializes on how political control works in the digital age and how citizens express themselves under censorship. Professor Pan's insights help us better understand the complex relationship between technology, governance, and freedom of speech in the modern world. So the agenda for today's event is like this. First, Professor Pan is going to share some of her most recent research entitled Disguised Repression, Targeting Opponents with Non-Political Crimes. Then I'm going to join her in a chat where I will ask a few questions on the broad lessons of her research. And then we are going to open up the floor for questions. So this is a terrific opportunity to learn from the leading scholar of China's digital media and public opinion landscape. So I invite you to maybe move to the front, listen, learn, and get your questions ready. So please join me in welcoming Professor Pan.
All right, great. It's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me. Today, I'm going to talk to you about this joint work with Xu, who's now a professor at Princeton, who is a postdoc here when we started this work, and Yiqing Xu, who's also here at Stanford. In September of 2020, Ren Zhiqiang, a real estate mogul, was sentenced to 18 years in prison for corruption. But many people think that his real crime was criticizing the Chinese Communist Party and its top leaders. And his case is not unique. So many other critics of the Chinese regime have been arrested and sentenced for crimes unrelated to political activism. Xue Manzi's example, Ai Weiwei, many others. And you see this around the world, where political dissidents and political opponents are sentenced for crimes unrelated to their political activity. So Shahbaz Sharif was the leader of Pakistan's main opposition party, was sentenced for corruption in 2020. Alexei Navalny, former opposition leader in Russia, died while in prison for charges for embezzlement and bribery. Thaksin Shinawatra, after he was overthrown in a military coup in Thailand in 2006, he was then charged with corruption. And the last example, Anwar Ibrahim of Malaysia, he was leading the Malaysian opposition party until he was sentenced to 5 years in prison on sodomy charges in 2015. So these are political opponents, political dissidents, who are imprisoned and charged with crimes unrelated to their political activity. And so the motivating question for us is, why do these authoritarian and sometimes democratic governments punish political opponents with these non-political crimes? And this is a puzzle because so many of these same governments have made many forms of political activity illegal. So it'd be very straightforward to charge these same people with just political crimes. And if we step back a bit and look at the literature on repression and dissent, generally, okay, so there's been a lot of research on the effects of repression, and the effects of repression are totally varied. There's no consensus in this literature. Sometimes repression suppresses dissent, other times it catalyzes mobilization. But regardless of the effects, there's this consensus that those who are targeted by repression don't like it, right? They oppose repression. And the same of bystanders, that everyone who witnesses repression happening is also in opposition to it. So across this big literature on repression and dissent, generally we think people are opposed to repression. And so what we're asking is that always the case? What if you, instead of framing it as repression, you describe the same activity through another lens, say criminal justice? What happens to support or opposition for repression when that happens, when repression is portrayed differently? So I'm going to lay out our argument, then show you an experiment that we did, a survey experiment, and then a case study for the external validity of this argument. Just to start with some terminology to make sure we're all on the same page. So when I talk about state repression, I'm talking about the actual or threatened use of physical or psychological sanctions taken by the state in response to behavioral challenges against the state, its institutions, practices, or personnel. So that's a wide range of things and includes threat or actual use of coercion. So that's everything from arrest, imprisonment, torture, killings, to threat of those actions. And then who are political dissidents? How am I using this term? So we're using this term political dissident to mean people who collectively or individually challenge the political authority of those in power. So what constitutes a dissident really differs by context. And many of you are very familiar with China and the Chinese political context. I'm using the word dissident here to talk about critics of the regime. So that might be different than what you typically think of as a dissident in China, but that's the definition broadly that we're using. And to be clear, a dissident in one context may be someone who is critical of the regime, but in another context, criticism is totally fine, and you would have to rise to some sort of armed insurgency to be considered a dissident. Okay, but political dissidents are those who are challenging the political authority in some way. They're more likely than the average person to take actions to challenge the political status quo. And so they're difficult for the regime to co-opt and, I would say, repress. So this is getting into the political science literature. We typically think that regimes can either co-opt, which is bribe and buy off, or repress, which is use coercion. So dissidents are more difficult to co-opt because they're more in opposition to the regime. So the cost of co-opting them would be quite high. And the repression, as I mentioned, has really variable effects. So when you try to, let's take an example of Stanford. When the Stanford administration tries to suppress protests, let's say around Palestine, sometimes it works, other times it backfires. And that's what we know about repression in general, is that its effects are variable. So because repression often backfires, and especially that's been true in the last 20 years or so, so popular protests have become increasingly challenging for the survival of authoritarian regimes globally. If you think about mid-1900s, so 1940s to 2000s, most authoritarian regimes changed from coups rather than popular mobilization. Okay, so that's kind of when I was in grad school, that's what we learned. Authoritarian regimes change when there are coups. But if you look at the data from 2000 to now, so in the last 20 years, twice as many authoritarian regimes have changed because of mass movements than coups. So the relative role of coups versus mass mobilization has really changed in the last 20 years. And from 2000 to 2017, about 60%, so more than half of all authoritarian regimes faced at least one large-scale anti-government protest. And it's in this context where there's this popular mobilization that's happening under authoritarian rule, that when autocrats apply repression, that repression often backfires. And why might that be? Well, protests are happening because of perceived injustice and illegitimacy of people in power. And then when you have repression, so what we're calling blatant repression, so punishing opponents for their political activity, that means the regime is punishing opponents for challenging its illegitimacy, which can then inflame those feelings of illegitimacy on part of the regime by opponents. Instead, what we think is happening instead of blatant repression is what we're calling disguised repression. So this is the act of charging dissidents with non-political crimes completely unrelated to any political activity they're engaging in. And so the example here is, if you think back to 2013, Xue Manzi was engaging in online criticism of the Chinese government and its policies online, but his charge was soliciting prostitutes and group licentiousness. So he could have been charged with online criticism because laws were passed at that time, making certain types of online criticism illegal. But instead, the charges were what we call disguised repression, so unrelated to his political activity. It's really important, this definition is defined by the type of charge, not by whether people believe it or not. So it doesn't matter if people don't believe it or if people do. And we think it's advantageous for the regime to actually charge dissidents with non-fabricated crimes. So I think in many contexts, there's the idea that you can fabricate a charge for a dissident, and I think that may happen, but if that's discovered, that would then reduce the effectiveness of this type of charge. Okay. So why does it work? Why does it work to charge someone with disguised repression as opposed to blatant repression? We think the mechanism is through morality and moral authority. So morality is a set of fundamental standards about the distinction between right and wrong, good and bad behavior. And moral authority is some external constraint on behavior. And it's a resource that's been studied in mobilization and protest. And the dissidents serve, we argue, as role models that are expected to adhere to moral codes. And when disguised repression happens, it damages those dissidents' moral standing. So it paints dissidents as offenders who violate societal moral codes, lowering support for the dissidents among those who follow them, as well as bystanders, and then justifying repression as punishment for immoral behavior. So instead of repression as immoral acts on behalf by the state, instead repression becomes just punishment for the immoral behavior of dissidents. And it also, as I mentioned, this definition is not about whether people believe or not. It doesn't matter whether people believe the charges or not. It creates cleavages among supporters. So some will believe the charges, some won't. And it decreases that coordination among potential dissenters and reduces the willingness to dissent. We also argue that it induces self-censorship among other would-be dissidents. So when you're a dissident and you see someone else being charged with a non-political crime, that increases the potential cost of dissent. It means that if you're someone who might have engaged in behavior similar to those charges, you might then abstain from political dissent. Because now you realize the punishment is not just for your political activity, before other forms of activity that you may have engaged in. So we think it will induce self-censorship among dissidents. Okay, so then the question is, we have this idea of disguised repression. Are authoritarian governments or transitional governments, hybrid regimes, using it all the time? And the answer is no. We don't think it's always being used because it has a cost. It requires time and effort to identify plausible or actual non-political crimes. And the state has to follow the normal rules and procedures of its judicial system in order to be credible. So when you have a dissident that's being charged for tax evasion, it's not the case that most people who are being charged with tax evasion are dissidents. Most people charged with tax evasion are not dissidents. And so when you charge a dissident with tax evasion, you're still following the normal rules and procedures and going through the case as you would for anyone charged with this non-political crime. And so because of this time and effort that's required, we think it's only used against people with greater mobilization power. And instead, blatant repression, which is just punishing people for political crimes, it also sends a signal that certain types of political activity are not allowed. So we think there will be some combination of blatant repression and disguised repression in any authoritarian context. And there's some scope conditions. So it requires that the judicial system that exists and has certain level of capacity. So there are rules and procedures, there are prosecutors who can move a case through the system, and that it has some independent credibility. And I think you'll see in my results that in the China context, China's judicial system does have this independent credibility. Because if the judicial system is seen completely as a vehicle for kind of those who hold political power, then this working through the judicial system is not going to have any extra effect. Okay, so these are the observable implications we think would accompany our argument. So disguised repression is going to decrease support for the dissident. It's going to increase support for punishing the dissident. It'll decrease other people's willingness to engage in dissent. It'll increase self-censorship among activists. And then dissidents with larger followings are the more likely targets. Okay, so that's what we think based on the argument. And then I'm going to show you an experiment we did as well as a case study to illustrate where we think these observations are found. Okay, so this is an online experiment, online survey of about 1,000 people in China. It's a nationwide sample. That's a convenience sample. And so we screen people who are in mainland China who are over the age of 18. We measure their political attitudes pre-treatment. And then we, for a random subset of participants, remind them that their responses are anonymous. So that's our way of checking to see whether there might be social desirability or preference falsification. I can answer questions about that if you have questions. And then we show them a description of a dissident and then randomly assign participants into 4 conditions. One in which they don't see any repression of the dissident, one with blatant repression, and 2 with disguised repression. One is soliciting prostitutes, one is tax evasion. Then we ask a series of attitudinal questions. We ask questions about whether they would dissent on behalf of the dissident. And then we measure self-censorship by asking a series of increasingly politically sensitive questions and seeing whether they answer those questions or select the option of would prefer not to respond. So this is some pre-treatment measures. We ask the participants whether they have criticized Chinese government policies, rules, or regulations on social media or online forums. So this is our measure of, is the respondent a critic of some sort? And then we also have a pre-treatment measure of the respondent's morality. So we're asking a series of world value surveys questions around whether they think things like fraudulent collection of government benefits, stealing, prostitution, violence, etc., are never justified or always justified. Because we're trying to measure the moral standards of the participants. And why are we doing that? It's because based on our theory, those who have less stringent moral standards and who have engaged in criticism are the people most likely to self-censor when they observe disguised repression happening. So basically, if I'm someone who has less stringent moral standards, maybe I've done some bad things, and yet I engage in criticism of the regime, when I see a dissident arrested for tax evasion or soliciting prostitutes, I might be like, oh, maybe I've done similar things, now I'm going to self-censor. Okay, so that's the theory behind it. That's why we have these pre-treatment measures. Okay, so then getting into the criticism. What we show participants is this. We say, a well-known opinion leader often criticizes current affairs and discusses viral public events online on behalf of the public, for example, calling for greater disclosure of officials' property, fighting for equal rights to education for children of migrant workers in cities, calling on government to strengthen law enforcement against child human trafficking. And these remarks are widely disseminated on the internet and have large social influence. Okay, so we made this is not a real person. These causes are a mixture of what other critics have expressed in China, because we didn't want the participants to think of a particular person. We wanted the general idea of some person, but not a specific individual. Okay, and then what are the treatment conditions? So the pure control has no further information, just that description I showed you. The first treatment condition is blatant repression, where the participant sees this. Says, recently this opinion leader, which you just read about, was taken away by the police. After a period of investigation and evidence collection, this person was charged with publishing and disseminating harmful information and was formally arrested. The police disclosed more detailed incriminating evidence, including the testimony of several witnesses. The verdict stated that this person posted the controversial remarks online, spread a large amount of harmful information, which had extremely bad influence on the public. The court sentenced the person to 3 years in prison. Okay, so that is the setup, and this language, so first of all, I'm showing you the translation, so this was in Chinese for the participants, was taken from actual charges against the dissidents, real dissidents. So this is based on the language that's typically used. Okay, the second treatment of tax evasion, the only things that are changed are, what's the part in pink? So instead of publishing, disseminating harmful information, now we have tax evasion, and then the details of the verdict. So in order to obtain more benefits, the person employed tricks to evade paying taxes, took advantage of some loopholes in the tax system. And then lastly, for soliciting prostitutes, again, the parts in the red are what's been changed in this treatment condition. So this was taken from Xue Manzi's kind of information about his arrest and sentencing. Okay, we think the disguised repression is happening through the mechanism of morality. And we randomly assign 1/3 of respondents to measure their perceptions of the dissident's morality. So what do you think? So they just saw the criticism, then they saw the treatment conditions, and then we asked, what do you think of this person's morality? Very low to very high. And we only asked like 1/3 of the respondents because we didn't know whether even asking this question would then influence the outcomes. So we only a random subset asked about morality. And then finally, in our outcome measures, we're interested in attitudes toward the dissident and attitudes toward repression. So in terms of attitude toward the dissident, we're saying, based on the information currently available, what's your general attitude toward this person? Very supportive or very disgusted. And then toward repression, do you think it's reasonable to arrest this person? Totally unreasonable and totally reasonable. Okay, so that's 2 outcome measures of attitude toward the dissident and repression. And then we also ask whether you're willing to dissent on behalf of the dissident. So saying, if netizens are calling for solidarity with a detained key opinion leader, would you express solidarity on social media? Just yes or no. And then at the end of the survey, we tell respondents they can answer a few more questions, and they always have the option of selecting I don't want to answer. And the questions, so these are questions that increase in their political sensitivity. I think the last question we ask is about term limits, but there are also other questions about policies. So we define self-censorship as refusing, saying I don't want to answer this question, or refuting the criticism and supporting the stance of the government. Okay, so that's outcome self-censorship. And this is what we find in terms of attitudes toward the key opinion leader. So the pure control is on the left, and then we're comparing disguised repression against the blatant repression, which is the second estimate. And what you can see is that when we show participants this description of tax evasion or soliciting prostitutes, it diminishes the support for the dissident compared to just the political crime. You'll also notice that even charging the dissident with a political crime decreases support. So there's something else happening, which is not the focus of this paper, around just using the judicial system against dissidents that has a kind of chilling effect. It also increases support for repression. So we don't have the pure control here because they didn't see anything about the arrests. But compared tax evasion and soliciting prostitutes against just charging the political crime, you see that there's greater support for the arrest that more respondents think it was totally reasonable to arrest this person. We also see a decreased willingness to dissent on behalf of the dissident. So this is, would you join others on social media and calling for solidarity? And that decreases for tax evasion and soliciting prostitutes compared to the political crime. And when we look at this, among the 1/3 of the sample who answered questions about morality, you can see that those who saw the tax evasion and soliciting prostitutes treatments evaluated the key opinion leader as less moral than those charged with a political crime. And all of these are less moral than someone who is not charged with any crime. Okay, so then turning to the self-censorship result. So we find self-censorship among critics with less stringent moral standards. So this is the full sample. And what we see is that there's no relationship between any of the treatments and self-censorship, willingness to answer those politically sensitive questions. But when we look at critics, you see that the prostitution treatment has a significant positive effect in increasing self-censorship. And when we look at the less morally stringent critics, that effect is larger. So the critics are people who said pre-treatment that they have criticized government policies on social media in China. And then the less morally stringent critics are people who were more tolerant of some of those world value survey questions on morality and also were critical. Okay, so that's an experiment, but it's only 1,000 people. Is there external validity? Is this what we're describing actually happened in the real world? And that's where we turn to a case study of 2013 Weibo. So before people stopped using Weibo, Weibo was a place where people posted opinions on social and political issues. So thinking back to 2011, 2012, 2013, people posted opinions on social political issues, often challenging the narratives of the state. So someone I've talked about before, Xue Manzi, had more than 10 million followers on Weibo and often criticized Chinese government policies. But in 2013, in the fall of 2013, there was a large crackdown on critics, especially online critics. And we identified 28 critics who were arrested and charged during this period, some with political crimes and some for non-political crimes. So these are 17 individuals who are charged with political crimes in this fall of 2013 period. So the crimes include gathering crowds to disrupt public order, illegal assembly, picking quarrels, provoking trouble, etc. And then at the same time, there are 11 individuals who were arrested and charged with non-political crimes. And these non-political crimes range from illegal business to the profiteering from spreading rumors, that's like engaging in legal spam. Other things like illegal dumping, extortion, blackmail, etc. Okay, so we had these 28 critics who are arrested and charged for political and non-political crimes. We searched for all Weibo posts from this 2013 period that mentioned their real names or their Weibo handles. And we collected about 13 million Weibo posts that reference these 28 people from 2011 to 2014. And this is the number of Weibo posts for those who are charged with political and non-political crimes. The non-political crimes are in the gray, and the political crimes are in the black. So what you can see is that there was way more social media discussion of those 11 individuals who are subsequently charged with non-political crimes. So we see this as support for that the Chinese government is more likely to use disguised repression against influential critics instead of using blatant repression. But then when people are charged with disguised repression, dissent on behalf of the critic really decreases. You really don't see any dissent on behalf of the people who are charged with the non-political crimes. So the vertical line here is when the crackdown happens. There's two lines here. The darker line are dissent on behalf of the dissidents charged with political crimes, and the light gray line is dissent on behalf of those who are charged with non-political crimes. And you can see, and so this is people calling for the release of those who are arrested. And basically, if someone is being charged with a non-political crime, no one is saying that they should be released. Whereas for those 17 who are charged with political crimes, there are a number of posts that are calling for their release. Okay. Then we also look at how are these critics perceived in terms of support or antagonism before and after their charge and arrest. So we have the Weibo post, we have the target, which is the name of the critic, and then we have a stance. Pro is positive, against is 0 toward that critic. And so we're training a deep learning model, a BERT model, to identify stances using Weibo data. And so this is non-political crimes. Okay, so this is the disguised repression. What you can see is that before the arrest, there's a pretty good level of support for these individuals. There's also some opposition to these individuals. But then after the arrest, the against stance toward these people who are being charged with non-political crimes really go up while the support decreases. And this looks very different than the political crimes. So if you look at the pre-period before the arrest, the kind of relative proportion of support and against is similar, right? There's more support, there's less opposition, there's some opposition. But then after the arrest, you see the switch for the non-political crimes, but the kind of opposite pattern for the political crimes. For political crimes, there's more support for these people after they're charged and arrested for political crimes. But that support goes away for those people who are charged with non-political crimes. Okay, so to sum up, when this repression is framed differently as immoral behavior, what we see is that there is support for repression, and there's decreased support, not only for the dissident, but a negative evaluation of morality, as well as support for dissent overall. And I think that has implications for our understanding of how governments use repression. So in the last few years, we had a lot of research on how modern authoritarian regimes who are subject to greater media scrutiny and information no longer can use blatant repression, or no longer can have to kind of hide repression in some way. But what we're finding is that instead of hiding repression, you can take the same actions, but you frame them differently in terms of what types of crimes are being charged. And I think this has also implications for judicial systems under authoritarian rule. So I also think there's been a lot of research talking about how when authoritarian regimes adopt rule of law, that ties the hands of the autocrats. But what we're finding here is that those same autocrats can actually use the judicial system to serve their coercive purposes. And so I think there's kind of broader questions for future research around how are, actually I would say both authoritarian and increasingly democratic governments using law to achieve coercive or other types of political purposes. I'll stop there and look forward to the conversation. Thank you.